Hollywood blockbusters have become increasingly reliant on visual effects over the past few decades, and recent advances in technology have made it so feats in VFX work that were considered impossible just a few years ago are now well within reach. More and more studios are using CGI in films, mostly because it's often cheaper than the alternative. In fact, many modern blockbusters are covered in so many digital layers that the original footage looks unrecognizable, and more often than not, completely ridiculous. Here's what these movies really looked like before special effects were added. 300 – Rise of an Empire. Zack Snyder's 300 made heavy use of CGI, and the technology used to create it had advanced immensely by the time its sequel, Rise of an Empire, came around, which of course meant squeezing every ounce of that tech into the movie. Director Noam Muro told Forbes, "It's amazing how the tools available 8 years later continue to develop. A major difference is CGI and the ability to create things in post that are convincing and complex and three-dimensional. The idea of creating a water movie without a drop of water on the set is remarkable." The filmmaker also revealed that they relied on some of the same techniques used in the Oscar-winning CGI blockbuster Gravity. Elysium. Neil Blomkamp's follow-up to his acclaimed debut District 9 didn't exactly go as planned, despite the star power of Matt Damon. The blockbuster sci-fi film cost a whopping $115 million to make, but only returned $93 million at the domestic box office. But while Blomkamp took full responsibility for the film's failings, the South African director didn't have any complaints about the special effects team, which had to put together over 3 times as many VFX shots as they had for District 9. Jurassic World. When Steven Spielberg decided to adapt Michael Crichton's novel Jurassic Park, CGI as we know it today didn't really exist. Spielberg brought on Industrial Light and Magic and tasked them with creating living, breathing dinosaurs using computer-generated graphics, and their efforts proved revolutionary. Of course, it wasn't just CGI that brought the inhabitants of Jurassic Park to life. There were a number of practical effects used too, and ILM mixed it up in the same way for Jurassic World. The 4th film in the franchise used detailed white casts of dinosaur heads that would later be layered with CGI for close-up shots. And they used actors in motion capture suits to make sure their movement seemed real. VFX supervisor Tim Alexander told Below the Line, "It gave us a new natural look for the animation. We ended up casting a person to give us a consistency in the performance. There were individual people being that raptor. We had suits that they would put on with a tail." Mad Max Fury Road. When George Miller returned to the world of Mad Max with his critically acclaimed Fury Road in 2015, audiences were blown away by the sequel's frenetic pace and visceral action, much of which was achieved through the hard work of inventive mechanics who built the vehicles used in the movie from scratch. The chase scenes were all shot for real, but the final product wouldn't have looked anywhere near as eye-popping if it weren't for the VFX team. Led by supervisor Andrew Jackson, hundreds of CGI artists enhanced over 2,000 shots in Fury Road, from adding characters to creating an epic toxic storm. The Avengers. When Earth's mightiest heroes teamed up on the big screen in 2012, the stakes were high for Marvel Studios and their team of visual effects artists. Jeff White, the film's VFX supervisor, told MTV, "With Avengers, there were so many things to get right. We created a lot of New York City for the film and needed to build flying shots of Iron Man all from photography. We had to build a new Iron Man suit, the Mark 7, and Stark Tower. We had to build the alien race. When you add all of those things up, there were quite a few challenges there." Green screens were used during most of the film's action sequences, so the cast spent a good chunk of time reacting to invisible threats and taking cover from fake explosions. The biggest hurdle they faced was inserting the Hulk into group situations. White explained, "We wanted it to feel very natural when he's sitting in that circle of Avengers. We spent a lot of time working on his skin and his hair and his teeth just to make sure all of that was believable." Man of Steel. To create the illusion of flight, Richard Donner's Superman employed wire rigs to hang leading man Christopher Reeve in front of different projected backgrounds. The film is a classic, and the effects look great in the 70s, but watching it today, it feels as though you're flying with Superman as opposed to him flying past you. Something Man of Steel director Zack Snyder wanted to avoid when he set out to make Superman soar. Snyder decided to use a handheld approach to filming Clark's flying scenes, which meant adding in most of the effects in post. Wire rigs and gimbals were used to suspend Henry Cavill in front of green screens, and the CGI team did the rest. Iron Man 3. When the first Iron Man movie dropped in 2008, director Jon Favreau wasn't known for CGI-heavy features, but advances in technology had convinced him to change his stance.
I've always steered away from using visual effects whenever possible. That being said, in the last few years, there have been a lot of wonderful visual effects movies where it's beginning to become seamless even to me.
Favreau returned for the sequel, but Shane Black took the reins for Iron Man 3, which contained some of the most challenging visual effects yet. Marvel Studios head honcho Kevin Feige explained, "We wanted the ability to be able to suit up anywhere, anyhow, without a giant gantry. The answer was having Tony Stark design outlets he injects just below the skin, not unlike the comics, allowing him to call the Iron Man suit from anywhere. To pull off the effect, each individual piece had to be digitally added to Robert Downey Jr.'s body after the fact." Spider-Man: Homecoming. Years of gymnastics training really paid off for Tom Holland on the set of Spider-Man: Homecoming, the character's eagerly anticipated introduction to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Even with the advances in CGI in recent years, it helps to have an actor who feels comfortable jumping around in tights and doesn't mind hanging around on wires all day long. This was the case with the film's Washington Monument scene. But while that was indeed Holland under the Spidey mask, the monument itself was a fake, erected on a studio soundstage.
We couldn't film at the real Washington Monument, but we built very impressive, very large chunks of the monument for filming.
Holland got up the structure with the aid of a wire rig, though even with his background, it was far from a walk in the park.
We did 2 weeks and every single shot was upside down. And my head just took a pounding, man, from all the blood that was rushing to it.
The Jungle Book. The CGI Jon Favreau used for Iron Man was nothing compared to what he did for his 2016 live-action adaptation of The Jungle Book. To create an entire jungle around a human actor, they needed to pull out all the stops. The lighting was particularly difficult. The director explained, "It's very hard to fake light and shadow, so everything became about using panels of LEDs to project light. So if we had the kid bowing before the elephants, you have panels where we actually would pre-animate the elephants, and they would cast the shadows on the kid in the exact right way." This meant that 12-year-old star Neil Setti had to imagine the animals he was interacting with, though Favreau was on hand to make the experience as real as possible for the young actor via puppets and actors in blue suits. RoboCop. Paul Verhoeven's RoboCop got the most out of the special effects available in the 80s, using a combination of stop-motion and prosthetic builds to create a movie that was disturbingly realistic at times. In the 2014 reboot, Murphy gets his injuries in an explosion that was created digitally, but the suit he dons afterward was actually real.
And there was a philosophy from the start that we're going to have a head-to-toe suit.
The challenge was building a suit that was mobile and easy for the digital department to add on to. The Martian. Ridley Scott is no stranger to special effects, but creating the red planet on screen for The Martian may have been his biggest challenge as a director. While some practical effects were used, a huge amount of digital work was required to give The Martian Scott's desired look. VFX supervisor Anders Langlands told Gizmodo, "Ridley Scott is famous for doing his little sketches, which are sort of really cool Ridleygrams. We'd ask, 'What do you want the background mountains to look like in this shot?' And he'd sketch out a little diagram of what they wanted. So you just literally match that and he'd be happy." A lot of time was spent finding the right hue for the skies and arid landscapes of Mars. Though in the end, it was a simple thing that caused the VFX team the most problems: the helmet visors.
But of course, glass visors would reflect the crew and the lights and the soundstage. So all the helmet visors you see in the film are actually added in digitally.
Suicide Squad. David Ayer's anti-hero ensemble Suicide Squad definitely had its flaws, but few of those were the fault of the many visual effects houses, 18 companies in total, that worked tirelessly on it. Imageworks were the ones who handled the squad's final battle with Enchantress, and the movie's villain proved to be a huge challenge, according to VFX supervisor Mark Breakspear. He told Art of VFX, "Enchantress was a unique challenge as the actress had been shot without a costume, as we had to add it in later to allow it to behave in a way that normal cloth or materials couldn't." Breakspear later told AWN that of the 300 shots they enhanced for the film's third act, dealing with the Enchantress's tattoos proved the most difficult. That was amazingly tricky to make sure it looked like skin, but also had the translucency that we needed to see the subsurface tattoos. The Wolf of Wall Street. Watching Martin Scorsese's ode to excess, The Wolf of Wall Street, the only scenes that stick out as being possibly computer-generated are the one during which Jordan Belfort's yacht sinks, and the one when a lion wanders freely through his office. but a visual effects reel released by Brainstorm Digital revealed that some of the most basic shots in the movie were rendered with CGI. From sun loungers to tennis courts, Brainstorm made plenty of subtle touches to bring the film in line with the director's vision. VFX producer Mark Russell told Digital Arts, "Working with Martin Scorsese, everything is about propelling a story forward and contributing to the film. I feel that with his movies, there is a kind of stylized realism to them that we have to integrate with." San Andreas. The amount of destruction on show in this Dwayne Johnson-led blockbuster definitely doesn't come cheap, but San Andreas actually cost a lot less to make than many of the big natural disaster flicks that came before it. According to Variety, the production budget was only $114 million, roughly half the amount needed to bring Roland Emmerich's 2012 to the big screen. The film's visual effects supervisor, Colin Strauss, was able to keep costs down by employing practical solutions to problems that most visual effects companies would solve with only computers today. As he explained it, you can make a $100 million movie look like a $200 million movie. You can make movies way smarter. CG for the sake of CG is always a mistake. They still had their work cut out for them though. 7 different companies worked together to render 1,300 VFX shots for the movie.
As movies become more and more reliant on computer effects, the entire landscape of filmmaking is changing. And sometimes there aren't any landscapes at all because it's all done in front of a green screen. The end result? Movie sets look completely ridiculous. Here's a behind-the-scenes look at what some of your favorite movies looked like before the special effects team went to work. The Planet of the Apes. Effects studio Weta Digital changed the game when they helped reboot Planet of the Apes with a new trilogy of prequels beginning with 2011's Rise of the Planet of the Apes. Producer Dylan Clark had a special amount of praise for Andy Serkis, the industry's top performance capture artist shown as protagonist Caesar, redefining screen acting in the digital age.
Andy Serkis is unlike any other actor. He can inhabit characters that don't speak and emote in ways that you don't really see often.
Fox campaigned for Serkis to get an Oscar nomination, but the call from the Academy never came, much to the actor's frustration. After the release of 2017's War of the Planet of the Apes, Serkis told Independent, "The awarding bodies should not discriminate about this being different. The visual effects render the character just like putting on makeup, except here it happens after the fact. It's digital makeup, if you will." Harry Potter. Bringing J.K. Rowling's wizarding world to life was only ever going to be possible with the help of CGI, and the films made increasingly good use of visual effects with each installment. While early CGI hasn't aged well, the quality of digital imagery from Goblet of Fire onward still holds up. The VFX team had to up their game for the 4th film in the series, as it marked the return of Lord Voldemort. Paul Franklin, the VFX supervisor for Order of the Phoenix and Half-Blood Prince, revealed that creating Voldemort's nose was a mammoth task. Franklin told Radio Times, "There's this idea that we put the shots through the computer and it just vanished off his face. His nose had to be painstakingly edited out, frame by frame, over the whole film. And then the snake slits had to be added and tracked very carefully using dots put on his face for reference. That's a lot of work for a couple nose slits, but Voldemort just wouldn't have been the same without them."
He's a great looking nose! Great nose! Wonderful nose!
Thanks for the new wand, Mr. Ollivander! Nothing's too good for James Potter!
Life of Pi. Filming this tale of a boy stranded at sea with a Bengal tiger came with a number of obstacles, but the biggest one wasn't the tiger, it was the water. Director Ang Lee explained, "I knew that to make it work with 3D, water had to become a character itself. I've never seen realistic water scenes in movies because water hits one side of a tank wall and bounces back like it would in a bathtub, but we needed to make it work. That's not to say the tiger was easy to create either. Scenes in which Pi interacts with the deadly animal were done using a crude puppet. The rest of it had to come from CGI. Game of Thrones. The season finales on Game of Thrones always have a cinematic quality, thanks in part to the digital wizardry of Pixomondo. Green screen use is kept to a minimum where possible, but bringing the creatures of George R.R. Martin's world into the mix requires some top-notch CGI. Pixomondo's VFX supervisor Sven Martin told The Washington Post that one of their biggest achievements has been making Daenerys' dragons blend seamlessly with the world around them. But all that magic doesn't happen until the dragon scenes have been shot, so how does Emilia Clarke connect with her fire-breathing babies? Green puppets. The actress told Huffington Post, "They have these amazing life-scale models that we use for camera rehearsals for the sake of the CGI people, and I got very attached to them. Fundamentally, they're dolls, I suppose, but it was nice to have something physical that I could really picture in my mind." Alice in Wonderland. Tim Burton was creating stunning visual effects long before relying heavily on CGI, using a combination of practical techniques to bring his vision to the screen. The former Disney artist used stop-motion animation, miniatures, and puppetry to great effect in his earlier works, though when the opportunity to direct his own version of Alice in Wonderland came along, he soon realized that he couldn't do it without leaning heavily on digital wizardry. This means that all the stars of the movie had to do the bulk of their acting in front of green screens. According to visual effects supervisor Ken Ralston, it was a challenge for the whole team. The green screen color, after long periods of time, seems to create a certain aggravation and irritation after staring at it for a long period. It is effective for compositing, but visually and psychologically exhausting to be surrounded by it for extended periods of time. Beauty and the Beast. When Disney first announced their intention to remake a number of their beloved animated classics in live-action format, the title that raised the most eyebrows was Beauty and the Beast. A film in which the majority of the supporting characters are animated household objects was always going to rely on CGI, though director Bill Condon has never liked digital effects and actively avoided using them wherever possible. He told IndieWire, "It was important to make everything that could be real, real. I'm not a big fan of CG movies. The idea is to feel grounded in a world and not be distracted by things that felt like additions." Unfortunately for the actor portraying the Beast, Dan Stevens, it was motion capture all the way, plus some stilts to get him to the right height.
It wasn't easy on stilts.
Stevens spoke to both Andy Serkis and Mark Ruffalo about their experiences in motion capture roles, and their feedback left him sweating. He added, "I think I was mildly terrified, but that's really generally what drives a lot of my decisions these days, is calibrating the right amount of terror. Nothing like a Disney movie to get that fear meter up, right?" The Dark Knight. Christopher Nolan is notorious for using real-life effects as much as possible, and most of the big effects in The Dark Knight were done on camera.
The only visual effect involved in that scene was to remove the RAM that they had built inside the truck.
But The Dark Knight still offered some unique CG challenges, especially since it was the first film to shoot scenes with IMAX cameras as opposed to using 35mm and converting in post. Visual effects supervisor Nick Davis spoke to Studio Daily about his experience on the Batman flick, saying, "It was important for the visual effects to look as though they were shot on set. Nolan didn't want the film to take on a gimmicky visual effects look." Taking this route meant that Nolan's first sequel to 2005's Batman Begins was a difficult movie to finish, as the visual effects had to be rendered in a higher resolution than ever before. When it came to creating the look for Harvey Two-Face Dent, Nolan wanted to remove layers, not add them. The VFX team had to digitally remove the skin. Two-Face's exposed eyeball had to be painstakingly animated by hand, as were the subtle changes in muscle tension. Gravity. The biggest challenge Alfonso Cuarón faced making his space epic Gravity was achieving a realistic lack of gravity on screen. Pulling it off involved an intricate mixture of practical and digital effects.
There are flares and there are mistakes, as it were, but no mistakes. It's all created.
The director talked to Space about the challenges in getting the effects to look realistic, saying, "It took a lot of education for the animators to fully grasp that the usual laws of cause and effect don't apply. In outer space, there is no up, there is no down." Co-stars Sandra Bullock and George Clooney were advised of their movements by real astronauts before being hooked up to a series of rigs created by Academy Award-winning visual effects artist Neil Corbould. It turns out that Bullock not only had to put up with being suspended from wires most of the day, there were electric shocks to contend with too. Corbould explained, "There was a charge in there like the static you feel underneath an electricity substation. If you walked out then touched someone, you'd get this massive shock." It may not have been easy work for the actors, but it worked out pretty well for Corbould, who won his second Oscar for Gravity. The Matrix. Arguably one of the most influential films of all time, The Matrix truly changed the landscape of action movies, with its memorable fight sequences becoming a benchmark for stunt coordinators and VFX artists alike. The term bullet time was coined for the epic slow-motion shots that the movie employed on the regular, which were created by visual effects guru John Gaeta. Gaeta told the New York Times, "The directors wanted to emulate the stylization found in Japanese animation. When we created weather, fire, and smoke, we wanted it to move not realistically, but impressionistically." Raw footage released as an extra on the DVD showed how bullet time was achieved using an intricate setup of perfectly positioned cameras and masses of green screen. The Lord of the Rings. Whenever Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy comes up, the first thing most people mention is Andy Serkis's brilliant motion capture performance, though creating Gollum was just one of many challenges Weta faced during the movies. Practical solutions like miniature models and forced perspective were used in places, but the bulk of the visual effects were achieved digitally. Even the interior of Bilbo Baggins' hobbit hole was computer-generated for some shots. Speaking to AWN, visual effects supervisor Jim Riegel revealed that Return of the King was his favorite of the three movies because of the monumental amount of work he and his team put into the picture. He explained, Return of the King has more shots than 1 and 2 combined. It's like 1,450. It was mind-boggling to figure out logistically how to do them all. It's something you never think you could have done, and you did it, like climbing Mount Everest. Pirates of the Caribbean: Dead Man's Chest. Bill Nighy's character Davy Jones made his first appearance in 2006's Dead Man's Chest, although you may not have recognized the actor under all those digital tentacles.
I was once required to be a squid man in a movie. I was an octopus guy, and I was perfectly happy watching that, because what are you going to say? You don't like my squid? Well then, live with it.
Visual effects supervisor John Knoll was able to develop a method that allowed Nighy to be on set with his fellow actors instead of filming separately in front of a green screen, which in turn allowed him to interact more believably and deliver a far more genuine performance. Knoll described the process to EW, saying, on a soundstage with 25 technicians staring at Bill and nobody to play off of, that quirkiness would have all gotten ironed out. Somebody would say that gesture is too off or too odd. It could have become a real sort of committee effort.
My squid was world class. My squid was an award-winning squid, because the 100 men and women who created my squid.
The post-credits scene in Pirates of the Caribbean: Dead Men Tell No Tales opened the door for the return of supernatural Sea Lord Davy Jones, although Nighy had no part in it. In fact, he had no idea his award-winning squid was even in the movie until a taxi driver told him about it.
It might be the A-list stars donning the capes and masks, but the real heroes of today's CGI-heavy comic book movies are the special effects artists. The men and women who really make it all possible. Of course, if you're not convinced that's the case, just try watching those movies before the effects were added in. 2014 was a big year for Marvel movies. Beyond the obvious successes of the MCU, Fox also released its eagerly awaited X-Men sequel, Days of Future Past. As Marvel prepared to introduce Aaron Taylor Johnson as the MCU's Quicksilver in Avengers: Age of Ultron, Fox exercised its rights to use the character by casting Evan Peters as the lightning-fast mutant for the X-Men prequel-sequel combo. The film earned rave reviews, and Peters' Quicksilver was one of its best parts, with one scene in particular making the headlines. Days of Future Past's now iconic super slow-mo kitchen scene may have looked amazing on film, but it wasn't at all easy to achieve. The sequence had to be shot at a mind-blowing 3,600 frames per second. Compare that to the standard 24 for most films. A frame rate that high requires huge amounts of light to work. In an interview with IO9, Peter said, "It was incredibly bright. A lot of the crew and Bryan Singer got to wear sunglasses. And the actors had to keep their eyes open for a long, long time with that bright light just blaring at you. It's like the sun. It's brighter than the sun. It's right there in your eyes, but the end result is so worth it, you just power through it." Unlike its predecessor, 2016's X-Men Apocalypse didn't go down too well with the critics. Still, it had a few redeeming features, chief among which was, yeah, you guessed it, Quicksilver's moment in the spotlight. Why mess with perfection, right? Although technological advances made between Days of Future Past and Apocalypse made things easier for the effects team, director Bryan Singer still chose to approach Quicksilver's second major set piece as practically as possible. This super slow-mo evacuation scene may have upped the ante from the kitchen scene in Days of Future Past, but Singer told Den of Geek that you'd be surprised just how much of it was real. He explained, "We did use certain visual effects, certain digital effects, and explosive algorithms, but we also took multiple Phantom 3D cameras and ran them in protective cases through physical explosions." Just because the CGI team had it easy, however, doesn't mean everyone did. We blew up our sets. We waited until we were done with them, and then blew them up. We flew the cameras through at 80 miles per hour, rolling at 3,000 frames per second. All in all, it took 6 weeks to make what amounted to 2 minutes of film. Considering how well that scene went down with fans, however, there's a good chance the crew decided it was more than worth the effort. The 5th MCU entry marked Chris Evans' debut as Steve Rogers, a scrawny New Yorker who becomes an all-American super soldier after agreeing to take part in a military experiment. Evans got jacked for the role, though his bulky frame meant that filming the scenes that take place before he transforms into Captain America was very tricky. The visual effects department shrunk Evans' actual body for some shots, but they also used a body double, actor Leander Deeney.
The goal was to make the audience fall in love with the character before he gets any muscles, before he puts on a costume, before he holds a shield.
Visual effects put Evan's face on Leander's body, and although his double was diligent about mimicking Evan's body language as best he could, the effects company still had their work cut out, comparing it to, quote, taking the head of a rhinoceros and putting it on the body of a gazelle. Logan was a milestone movie in Fox's long-running X-Men franchise, not only because it was Hugh Jackman's final bow as Wolverine, but also because it was the first time fans got to see the clawed mutant in all his R-rated glory. The levels of violence on display during Logan were like nothing before seen in the X-Men universe, and this meant the VFX team had their work cut out for them. But Rising Sun Pictures VFX supervisor Dennis Jones relished the challenge. He told Art of VFX, Logan is more brutal, visceral, and has direct consequences for the characters involved. The R rating that was confirmed from the start introduced another dynamic to play with, albeit in a restrained fashion. In The Wolverine, some of our shots had to be amended to remove blood and claw penetration, so it was great to be able to set the character free from these constraints. But that gore went far beyond just computer graphics. Makeup designer Joe Harlow also told The Verge that the level of physical trauma in this film is something I haven't had to contend with since the early years when I was smearing blood around. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2's visual effects supervisor Chris Townsend wasn't part of the team that worked on the first Guardians movie, but he had previously worked with Marvel on Captain America, the First Avenger, and Iron Man 3, receiving an Oscar nomination for the latter. When offered the opportunity to oversee the Guardians sequel, Townsend jumped at the chance to return to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He told Rotoscopers, "I'm a huge fan of the films. I think from a creative and visual effects point of view, they're some of the funnest stuff out there." For the film's epic third act, in which the Guardians face Ego inside his own planet, Townsend accepted a bid from Weta Digital, who picked up the action right after Ego reveals to Quill that he gave his mother cancer. Weta's Guy Williams told Art of VFX, "From that point on, it is mostly our work. We go all the way until Yondu and Quill rise above the planet as it is destroyed behind them." The New Zealand-based visual effects house had up to 490 staffers working on Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 at one stage, according to Williams, who admitted to losing plenty of sleep over the highly complicated nature of the project. Let's face it, if you're the king of Wakanda, you've got to ride in style. And with the world's largest supply of the miracle metal vibranium at your disposal, a Rolls-Royce or an Air Force One-style Boeing 747 simply won't do. Luckily, those Wakandan engineers and scientists clearly knew what they were doing when they designed Black Panther's jet. When King T'Challa arrived in Wakanda from his journeys abroad, he did so on a badass, super sleek stealth plane that looks like it came right out of Area 51. You wouldn't know that if you were just watching the raw dailies, though. In the original footage, there was no jet, no landing platform. Heck, there wasn't even any Wakanda. There were just a handful of actors on a set and a large blue screen in the background. It's a little jarring to see that the Mad Titan, the destroyer of civilizations, the wicked warlord Thanos is actually, well, it's Josh Brolin wearing what looks like an overpriced, skin-tight biker's outfit. While Brolin is probably thankful he didn't have to wear any space armor and paint his skin purple for the role, he was still very much present during the filming of Infinity War and Endgame thanks to the wonders of motion capture technology. Brolin had never done mocap before, but he saw the light after seeing what his future Avengers castmate Benedict Cumberbatch was able to do as Smaug in The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug.
"I kill wherever I please, and none shall stop me."
Indeed, Brolin's one-on-one interactions with his castmates added an extra layer of creepy credibility that made the Mad Titan that much scarier in the final movies. One of the most underrated aspects of Avengers Infinity War was Peter Dinklage's performance as Eitri, the King of the Dwarves. Here, the actor, who only stands about 4'4", was playing a 20-foot giant. The Lord of the Rings films famously used forced perspective to make people look like Hobbit-sized, but this film used a different approach. Instead, having Dinklage play opposite mini cutouts of Thor, Groot, and Rocket Raccoon. This makes Dinklage's scene-stealing performance that much more impressive, as he was basically performing with dolls. Chris Hemsworth, who also had to act opposite nothing, would shoot his scenes on a set, while Dinklage performed against a blue screen. It's not always easy, this acting malarkey. Infinity War's climactic Battle of Wakanda was filmed on an 8,000-acre farm called Chattahoochee Hills Eventing, about 40 minutes outside Atlanta. Instead of thousands of extras, only 70 performers were used, but they became more than 500 Wakandans digitally, and proceeded to do the battle with Thanos' army of 10,000 alien monsters known as Outriders, which were also digitally produced. The art department even added indigenous African trees and created an artificial river for the scene, with a massive pump that was gushing out up to 30,000 gallons per minute. That's a lot of effort for something that's barely even visible in the finished movie. Thor's arrival at the Battle of Wakanda may very well be the most epic superhero entrance ever. But when you see what it looked like before the CGI was added, okay, it's still pretty epic, but it's not quite the same as the finished product. For this scene, Chris Hemsworth donned his full Thor attire and wielded a massive axe that just needed a little CG love to become the mighty Stormbreaker. Of course, what he didn't have was a smack-talking, gun-toting raccoon on his shoulder, an angsty teenage tree, hundreds of Wakandan warriors, or an invading army of 10,000 alien monsters. So yeah, most of the stuff in the scene was added after the fact. All the more reason to be impressed with Chris Hemsworth's performance, considering he was basically acting by himself in a $10,000 Halloween costume. Following Hulk's vicious beatdown at the hands of Thanos in Avengers Infinity War, Marvel fans were on the edges of their seats waiting to find out what the future held for everyone's favorite angry green giant. None but the most die-hard comic book fans would have guessed it would be Professor Hulk. According to animation boss, it was Framestore who breathed life into Endgame's Bruce Banner Hulk hybrid. The process started by taking source footage of Mark Ruffalo and matching it to animation. This animation was then used for 60 shots, with headcam footage used for reference. According to animation supervisor Max Solomon, it was absolutely about channeling Bruce Banner. His face is very expressive, every nuance, every little twitch and eye dart, slight curl of the lip and muscle tension needed to be translated. VFX supervisor Stuart Penn explained, "There was a lot of work involved as their face shapes are so different. Hulk is massive, his mouth proportionally bigger, his eyes are sunken with deeper sockets. Tiny changes to his face had a huge effect on the performance." Having wiped out half of all life in Infinity War, a past version of Thanos returns to Earth in Endgame's final act, in a desperate attempt to regain the 6 Infinity Stones from the Avengers. Unfortunately for him, this is the first time this version of the Mad Titan has gone up against Captain Marvel. Fans had been eagerly anticipating Captain Marvel's bout against Thanos ever since she was teased in the post-credit scene to Avengers Infinity War. After seeing what she was capable of during both her own movie and her handful of earlier scenes in Endgame, it became clear that the Mad Titan had more than met his match in Danvers. But bringing this fight to life on set appears to have been considerably less epic than how it wound up being on the big screen. But hey, that's the magic of the movies for you. Tony Stark's last stand against Thanos has to be one of the MCU's greatest ever scenes. That final line was a callback to one first uttered 11 years prior to Endgame in Iron Man, the film that launched the biggest franchise in history, and there couldn't have been a better line for Tony Stark to go out on. Strangely enough, however, it almost didn't happen. During a Q&A that took place in the wake of the film's release, the Russo brothers explained, "Tony used to not say anything in that moment, and we were in the editing room going, he has to say something." This is a character who has lived and died by quips, and our editor Jeff Ford, who's been with us all 4 movies and is an amazing storyteller, said, "Why don't we just go full circle with it and say, I am Iron Man?" And we're like, "Get the cameras, we have to shoot this tomorrow." The scene turned out to be the last one filmed during Endgame's reshoots, and the behind-the-scenes reality of this iconic moment was thankfully captured by Downey's assistant, Jimmy Rich.
Traditionally, horror isn't a genre that depends on digital trickery. Taking a practical approach is often not only cheaper, but more effective when it comes to unnerving an audience. And horror movies rarely enjoy the freedom of a big budget, especially when the big studios aren't involved. Advances in technology in recent years have made convincing visual effects far more accessible, however, to the point that even low-budget productions can take advantage. Green screens are now commonplace on horror sets, and if you strip away all the special effects, what you're left with isn't very scary at all. Hollow Man. Paul Verhoeven's Hollow Man fell well short of recouping the $95 million production budget at the domestic box office, and it took a hammering in the media, with 27% on Rotten Tomatoes. But even the harshest critics of the film admitted that the special effects were impressive. Verhoeven told DVD Talk, "We really tried to link the special effects shots with the actors as much as possible. We wanted coherence between the special effects and the actors so people would accept the effects as part of the actor's scene." Jerome Chen, senior VFX supervisor at Sony Pictures Imageworks, told FX Guide, "That film was all done with rotomation off the performance of Kevin Bacon. No motion capture, just hard thousands of hours of labor." The Ring. Gore Verbinski's box office smash The Ring kick-started Hollywood's obsession with Japanese horror during the mid-2000s. Naomi Watts plays a Seattle journalist who's investigating an urban legend about a videotape that kills anyone who watches it in 7 days. When her son unwittingly pops said tape into their VHS player, the pair are haunted by Samara, who crawls out of a well and straight through the television. But the look of the vengeful ghost was the in-camera work of special effects makeup artist Rick Baker. He said,
"I think the scariest thing about Samara, for me anyways, is not knowing what's under that hair."
Crimson Peak. Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water marks a return to form for the director, whose 2015 gothic romance Crimson Peak tanked hard at the box office. The latter relied on what VFX supervisor Chris McLean called practical hybrids for the most part, mixing green screen with creature builds. One example can be seen towards the end of the movie when Edith has a farewell moment with Thomas and her fingers pass right through his face. The Conjuring 2. James Wan's The Conjuring, in 2013, was the first film in what would later evolve into a shared movie universe encompassing the Annabelle series, as well as The Nun and The Crooked Man. Visual effects artist David Ridlin worked on a few shots for the first Conjuring movie, rendering some everyday items that you probably didn't realize were CGI, including the scariest bedsheet ever. VFX artist Didier Konings was hired to take care of the little details in 2016's The Conjuring 2, removing security cameras and altering buildings to make the 1970s set look authentic. The Thing.
On action, the beast comes forward, it's gonna be on fire. Action!
A prequel to John Carpenter's 1982 horror classic of the same name. 2011's The Thing follows the plight of a doomed group of scientists who discover a living alien buried deep in a block of Antarctic ice.
Now how's this motherfucker wake up after thousands of years in the ice?
The film's VFX supervisor, Jesper Klovsrud, described his process to the Art of VFX, saying, "As the teeth of the alien mouth rip the skin, we see the inside tentacles push through while Juliet's head is forced towards her back." Gross. Godzilla. Director Gareth Edwards landed on Hollywood's radar with his visually impressive low-budget breakout Monsters in 2010. And the following year, he was offered the job of rebooting Godzilla. Edwards was initially concerned that signing on for a Hollywood blockbuster meant he would have to relinquish control to a certain extent, but the studio's reaction to the first teaser trailer he cut put his mind at ease. He told FX Guide, "I just wanted to do what I thought would give me goosebumps." Edwards brought in VFX house MPC to make the trailer, and they went on to render several set pieces in the final film, including Godzilla causing havoc in San Francisco Bay. The Shallows. Survival horror thriller The Shallows seemed to come out of nowhere in 2016, going certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. The predator stalking Blake Lively throughout the film was created by brilliantly named Important Looking Pirates, a Swedish VFX house that specialized in sharks. Visual effects supervisor Scott E. Anderson told FSR, "Most animals, sharks included, are designed to blend into the environment. Our job is to use visibility selectively to meet the needs of the film and direct the audience and eye when we want or need to." The Purge, election year. Visual effects veteran James Haddon has worked on countless horror franchises over the years, but none have been quite as timely as 2016's The Purge, election year. Thanks to Haddon's company VFX Legion, viewers were able to experience another frightening night on the lawless streets of a bleak near-future America. Though for the actors involved, many of those scenes were created in post. According to Haddon, his priority on a project like this one is delivering value for money. He told FrightFind, "Horror movies do not have huge budgets, and so the idea that CG is going to be in your horror movie, it's really hard to do because they're not funded to do that." Haddon went on to explain that it's his personal policy to make sure that any shots his company is responsible for don't look cheap, even if they are cheap by blockbuster standards, adding, "My goal in delivering shots out of VFX Legion to the world is that they should not bump in the cut." Prometheus. A number of VFX houses worked on Ridley Scott's 2012 return to the Alien franchise, including MPC, Fuel VFX, Luma Pictures, and Weta Digital. The New Zealand-based company was tasked with rendering the film's new race of giant humanoid extraterrestrials, which involved digitally enhancing the on-set performance of a costumed actor. Weta's VFX supervisor Martin Hill said, "Usually we would strive to make a digi character as anatomically accurate as possible in terms of its musculature, articulation, and the thickness and pliability of the fat under the skin. We had to make some compromises to match an actor in silicone prosthetics." Designing the look of the engineers was a job that fell to concept artist Neville Page. He told Wired that when Scott first approached him, the director envisioned the engineers as a mixture between some well-known statues and one legendary musician. Page said Scott had specific metaphors in mind for the artist, telling Wired,
"I was looking at reference of Statue of Liberty, the Michelangelo sculptures, specifically David, and oddly, Elvis Presley."
World War Z. When he sat down to discuss his team's achievements with Wired, World War Z visual effects supervisor Scott Farrar explained that it was always their intention to break from the traditional zombie mold with this movie. They went with a scientific approach, reckoning that a real virus of this nature would make humans fast, vicious, and relentless. The biggest example is the epic moment when 8,500 computer-animated zombies pile on top of each other to breach the walls of Israel. Farrar said, "The single hardest thing about that was just making those piles look right without something going wrong. You're always battling with what looks good and cool in a movie and still feels real. You can look at these shots every day for months, and then all of a sudden you're almost ready to go to final and somebody will spot something that's wrong in the shot. It's like, where's Waldo?" While CGI clearly played a massive part in bringing this world to life, animation director Andrew Jones favored a mixture of computer graphics and practical performances, hiring talented contortionists who could mimic the semi-possessed look they were going for. Krampus. To promote their work on the 2015 Christmas horror movie Krampus, Weta released a mock interview with the film's chief gingerbread handler, who claimed,
"Working with the gingerbread man on set was a real challenge. They were easily startled, fragile, and really skittish."
In reality, they were one of the smaller challenges Weta faced on the project, which was approached in a largely practical fashion for sake of nostalgia. Weta Workshop co-founder Richard Taylor said,
"This is a classic 80s monster movie. This is fantastic stuff. This is what we live for. This is what gets us up in the morning."
From the animatronic cherub that attacks Toni Collette in the attic to the terrifying Jack-in-the-Box operated from inside by 3 puppeteers, Krampus minions were as ingenious as they were unnerving, and none more so than the Anti-Claus himself. The titular demon was portrayed by Luke Hawker, who wore a custom-made costume complete with hoof stilts and prosthetic finger extensions. He said of the heavy suit,
"Your muscles are just burning and you're sweating and you're thinking, am I going to throw up?" And then Mike comes in and the smile on his face just says it all.
I Am Legend. The Will Smith-led adaptation of Richard Matheson's seminal zombie novel I Am Legend did pretty well with the critics and didn't disappoint at the box office. But it's widely accepted that the CGI sucked. The film was fast-tracked into production before a script had even been completed, and the schedule started to get backed up when the practical creature effects looked terrible on camera. The decision was made to render the undead digitally, though in reality there was never enough time to make them look convincing. Director Francis Lawrence told Den of Geek, "It was better than doing the live versions at that time because it didn't work, but we needed 6 more months on the post-end to get all the visual effects right, because there were some close-ups that were stunning, and then you get some shots that I never got right, and it just kills it." One of the big downfalls for me with that movie personally was with the visual effects. VFX supervisor Yannick Sears told AWN that the animators were still redesigning the creatures during post-production to match the, quote, continually evolving nature of the film. Deadly Honeymoon. Even if you consider yourself a true gorehound, chances are you've never heard of Deadly Honeymoon. This low-budget TV movie from 2010 probably would have flown under the radar altogether had it not been based on true events that took place 5 years earlier. A story that grabbed news headlines and became the subject of a Dateline report. In 2005, newlywed George Smith and his bride Jennifer set sail on their dream honeymoon cruise, though only one of them would survive. The groom simply vanished one night, a mystery that has never been solved. Lifetime adapted the story into a television feature, changing the names and creating their own explanation. They cast Summer Glau in the role of wife-turned-widow Lindsay, which was a dream come true according to the actress. She told My San Antonio, "I've wanted to do a Lifetime movie since I was a little girl. It's a really good way for girls to get challenging dramatic roles." Her faith in the network was rewarded when they hired an experienced VFX crew to turn the set into the open ocean.
Computer-generated effects are ubiquitous in Hollywood, so when something amazing happens on screen, audiences usually assume they're seeing a digital fantasy. But despite the surge in CGI, some directors are still committed to doing special effects the old-fashioned way, before today's digital wizardry existed. From puppets to prosthetics to old-school camera tricks, we've rounded up some of the most insane scenes you'll never believe were created without computers. Flipping out. Fact. Director Christopher Nolan actively dislikes CGI and believes that audiences prefer the real thing as much as he does, so he uses practical effects in his films whenever possible. Remember that epic car chase in The Dark Knight that ended with a giant 18-wheeler going butt over tea kettle right in the middle of an actual city block?
He missed!
Special effects genies used computers to edit out some of the equipment involved in the stunt, but everything else was completely real, aided by a remote-controlled piston that was installed in the truck to propel its rear off the ground. The scene was filmed from 7 different angles, because when you're making an 18-wheeler do a somersault in the middle of the night in downtown Chicago, there is no such thing as take 2. Anti-gravity fisticuffs. The Dark Knight director didn't limit his commitment to practical effects only to his Batman franchise, which, don't forget, also included blasting a plane in half mid-air.
Now what's the next step of your master plan?
Crashing this plane.
In Inception, Nolan and his team created the gravity-defying dream within a dream fight scene by channeling none other than talented singer and hat enthusiast Jamiroquai and built a 100-foot-long hotel hallway on a rotating set. According to actor Joseph Gordon-Levitt, the filming process required as much mental flexibility as it did acrobatic balance. Telling E! Online, "I had to think of it like, this is the ground. Okay, now this is the ground. And now this is the ground. It was just that the ground was always moving under me. That was the mind game I had to play to make it work." With a camera mounted on a track that ran the length of the set, Nolan was able to create seamless, stable shots even as the hallway itself spun 360 degrees. But Nolan wasn't the one who invented the old rotating room. The blood-bathing bed. CGI wasn't much of an option back in 1984, especially for a low-budget horror flick like Wes Craven's Nightmare on Elm Street. So when Craven's horror franchise introduced audiences to the original fedora-wearing monster, it had to pull off its nightmarish special effects the old-fashioned way. These days, the soul-sucking blood geyser that consumed Johnny Depp would probably be done with computers. But for the original Nightmare, the effects team came up with an inventive way to pull it off. The bedroom set was built on a rotating axis which could be turned a full 360 degrees. What you see is actually an upside-down set. Once the bedroom was flipped, all they had to do was pour 500 gallons of fake blood through the bed and let gravity do the rest. Simple, right? Men Becoming Wolves. An American Werewolf in London featured animatronic heads, prosthetic body parts, and the most elaborate assortment of merkins in the history of film. Werewolf's iconic transformation scene was achieved with nothing but good old-fashioned practical effects, and the magic of Rick Baker. The effects guru created prosthetic versions of actor David Norton's limbs, then fitted them with air bladders to make them deform as Norton's character turned from man to wolf. For the facial transformation, 2 animatronic heads created the illusion of the actor's head reshaping itself into something more wolf-like. And the furry overcoat? That effect used a latex skin threaded with thousands and thousands of wiry hairs. Baker filmed the hair being pulled backwards through the skin, then reversed the shot to stimulate rapid growth. The final result was so realistic and terrifying that it earned its creator the 1982 Academy Award for Best Makeup. And when the movie got its inevitable 21st century reboot in the form of An American Werewolf in Paris, the terrible CGI effects couldn't hold a candle to this practical wizardry. The Killer T-Rex. Hold on to your butts. There's a reason the Lizard King of Jurassic Park was such an imposing presence. He was a real-life, full-sized animatronic that nearly killed someone on set. The T-Rex weighed 9,000 pounds and was built on a skeleton made of hydraulic motors and moving metal parts. He was also decidedly dangerous. During the production, a crew member was unlucky enough to be stuck inside the belly of the beast during a power outage, sending thousands of pounds of hydraulics crushing down on him. Fortunately, he lived to tell the tale. Even the digital dinosaurs of Jurassic Park were often a combination of CGI and puppetry. For instance, the Brachiosaurus that sneezed all over Lex was only a digisaur from the neck down. The head was all real for most of its time on screen, as was the copious spray of dino snot, much to the dismay of actress Ariana Richards. Little Hobbits, big world. Rather than rely completely on post-production CGI to shrink Elijah Wood or embiggen Ian McKellen, Peter Jackson often used old-school optical illusions to make his hobbits teeny tiny in comparison to all the wizards, orcs, and elves of Middle-earth. Using camera angles, cropping, and the actor's relative positioning, the effect known as forced perspective makes them appear to be differently sized than they actually are. In theory, it's simple. In practice, it meant that many shots had to be staged down to the millimeter throughout the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy, as well as the Hobbit trilogy a decade later. Liquid Metal Evil. In 1991, Terminator 2 was a groundbreaking example of the power of digital effects, boasting CGI that went miles beyond anything else that had been done. However, what made the movie so spectacular wasn't the CGI alone, but the way James Cameron seamlessly integrated the computer-animated cuts with practical effects. For every purely digital shot of T-1000 slithering around in a liquid metal form, there was a scene rendered the old-fashioned way, with puppets and expert camera work, giving the film a sense of real-world weight. Most incredibly, every time the T-1000 was blasted apart, Stan Winston's special effects team would bring in a mangled metallic puppet complete with a cast of actor Robert Patrick's head to thrash around. In the T-1000's last moments, the blown-up puppet is so seamlessly intercut with motion capture effects that you can't even tell where one ends and the other begins.
You simply can't make a superhero film without relying on the work of visual effects artists to some degree, but the level of reliance in the modern age has reached heights that it can be difficult to really understand unless you see the original footage with your own eyes. Christopher Nolan is known for taking a practical approach to effects whenever possible, but even he turns to the VFX team from time to time. Visual effects co-supervisor Dan Glass revealed that the movie had nearly 600 effects shots. One of the most challenging jobs that Glass and his partner Yannick Surs faced was making the Batmobile look convincing, which they achieved through a mixture of trick shots and miniatures. The miniatures they created weren't actually that mini at all. They made a 3/4 scale 5-foot Batmobile. Glass explained, "The key with miniatures is scale, and Yannick pushed hard to use large miniatures. Some were 35 feet tall." UK-based visual effects house Double Negative completed half of the 600 effects shots in the movie, and it was nominated at the Visual Effects Society Awards for its efforts.
So what do you think? Does it come in black?
Keanu Reeves' relationship with the Hollywood press has always been love-hate. 2005's Constantine was one of the hate moments, as the majority of movie critics bashed the supernatural DC flick. The film suffered from a fundamental change deep into production, according to Deke Farrand, HatchFX co-founder and lead matte painter. He explained, "We began working on Constantine in April of 2004. The original delivery was set for the end of July. However, in mid-July, as we were finalizing the final composites, there was a drastic change in direction, which resulted in starting a new concept phase." Fans of the Green Lantern first started to worry about the adaptation when they discovered that Hal Jordan's suit was to be made entirely from CGI so that the VFX teams would have some flexibility with the design. Ryan Reynolds wore a tracking suit and all the effects were added in after filming.
So how they did that was using a motion capture suit which has all these dots and you look like a crash test dummy.
In the end, the suit itself was passable, but the unnatural looking mask wound up ruining the overall effect. While many people pointed to the substandard CGI, Reynolds blamed the script for the film's failings, revealing that it hadn't even been written when he signed on to star. He told Yahoo, "When we shot Green Lantern, nobody auditioning for the role of Green Lantern was given the opportunity to read the script because the script didn't exist. In the end, most audiences had the same reaction."
Green!
3 years after debuting as the Man of Steel, Henry Cavill was back in the red cape and facing off against Ben Affleck's Batman. According to Scanline's VFX supervisor Brian Hirota, director Zack Snyder came to him with an idea for a montage that showed Superman saving people all over the world, which he wanted to intercut with news stations debating whether or not the Kryptonian was welcome on Earth. Henry Cavill was digitally dropped into numerous dangerous situations and natural disasters, one of which was a huge flood. While the finished product looks pretty convincing, it turns out it was shot on an asphalt backlot in Michigan. Hirota told Art of VFX, "In post, we used our Flowline software to simulate the river and debris going around the houses. We extended the environment with added extra houses, trees, and distant mountain ranges. After that, it was simply a matter of dropping Superman into the mix, and just like that, you have a disastrous flood." It bombed hard with critics, but DC's anti-hero ensemble Suicide Squad still made a ton of money. A lot of visual effects went into the film, so much that the load had to be divided between 17 different VFX houses. One such company was MPC, whose workload included Harley Quinn's elevator fight scene. MPC visual effects supervisor Seth Morey told Art of VFX, "Plates were shot of Harley fighting with a practical actor. Our goal was to replace the heads on these practical actors so that the eyes on the head were alive and blinking during each shot, and so that the head breathed and pulsed." Morey revealed that his favorite part of the sequence was blowing up these heads, every one of which was unique down to the last detail. The DC Extended Universe was given a breath of fresh air with Wonder Woman. The film looked great, thanks in no small part to the work of effects companies like MPC, who contributed around 500 visual effects shots. Led by VFX supervisor Jessica Norman, the MPC team helped create the epic beach battle, the No Man's Land sequence, and several other action scenes. The company's website reveals, "The beach battle sequence was shot on the west coast of Italy across 2 beaches. MPC's environmental artists extended the beach and added cliff backdrops. Cliffs and islands were lit and rendered by MPC's lighting team." MPC also developed, quote, "new controls for hair simulations to be able to maintain the shape and style of Wonder Woman's hair in these action-packed scenes. There was a time when an actor's hair was the responsibility of makeup alone, but in the age of superhero blockbusters, every strand is subject to scrutiny from the visual effects department." While it might not have lived up to the standard set by Wonder Woman, Justice League still fared better with the critics than the first 3 films in the franchise. The movie seemed destined to fail after Zack Snyder left the project before the shoot was done. Marvel stalwart Joss Whedon stepped in to finish the film, but the result was a hodgepodge of styles that didn't work as well as Warner Brothers might have imagined. The film's visual effects would become a huge talking point, especially when it was revealed that Warner Brothers was forced to digitally remove a mustache that Henry Cavill had grown for Mission Impossible Fallout, because Paramount refused to let him shave it for Justice League reshoots.
It comes and goes.
Some of the CGI on Cavill's upper lip was downright awful, with his mouth looking particularly deformed in the film's opening moments. An unnamed Justice League VFX artist said, "It shouldn't have been improved internally, let alone gone all the way to make it into the film." Well, you know what they say about mustaches.
Easy to lose. If you dig around, it's usually close by.
When George Lucas came up with the idea of Star Wars in the mid-1970s, setting an adventure of this scope in outer space had never been done before. So how did he get the film to look so good when there were no visual effects companies up to the challenge at the time? He started his own. Industrial Light and Magic was formed to handle the special effects in Star Wars, and they're still revolutionizing the industry with their work. Let's peek behind the scenes at what Star Wars movies look like before they work their magic. A New Hope. The original trilogy is known for its use of practical effects, but in truth, those films relied on visual trickery just as much as their successors. Sprawling CGI backgrounds were not an option when the first Star Wars movie was being made, so the effects artists at ILM came up with some ingenious alternatives. Matte glass paintings were painstakingly created by hand and then added to scenes later, but a different technique was needed to bring the movie's many spaceships to life. Former ILM frontman John Dykstra told Den of Geek, "Back in the days of Star Wars, we kind of walked into an empty warehouse and sat on the floor and went, how are we going to do this?" The producers, Gary Kurtz of Fox and George Lucas, took an incredible risk by listening to what myself and my collaborators had to say with regard to how to do this, because we were inventing this stuff from scratch. When it came to Han Solo's Millennium Falcon, Dykstra decided to create a model and film it in front of a blue screen using an early computer-controlled camera, which allowed his team to add all of the outer space details in post. The Empire Strikes Back. Dykstra and his team won an Oscar for their revolutionary work on Star Wars, but Lucas chose not to bring Dykstra along when he moved his base of operations to San Francisco. It was here that ILM got to work on the next movie. But despite the success of the first film, budget restraints were still a problem when it came to making The Empire Strikes Back. As VFX supervisor Richard Edlund later pointed out, computer graphics were extremely expensive, very slow, and the resolution was always a problem. Luckily for Edlund and Lucas, the team they'd assembled proved more than capable of delivering results within their means. The film's cinematographer Mark Virgo compared this era in cinematic history to the lunar program, referring to the period as an amazing cooperative of artists, imagination, optics, engineering, and homebrewed software. Return of the Jedi. By the time 1983's Return of the Jedi went into production, the ILM crew had found their groove. Master of Puppets Phil Tippett was brought in to head up the creature shop that ultimately created the Ewoks, and the rest of the effects work was divided between Richard Edlund, Ken Ralston, and Dennis Muren. Among the jobs that fell to Muren was the speeder bike chase, one of the hardest sequences in the film with 100 total effect shots. Muren explained, because the bikes were going to be blue screen, the backgrounds didn't require that many different shots to do, because we could use them over and over again. I got the idea to do it with a Steadicam. I called Garrett Brown up, who invented it, and he flew out from back east, and we did a test out in Samuel Taylor Park out here with him just walking along with the camera, shooting 1 frame a second. And the thing worked. Muller and Brown spent several days in the woods, just filming trees from different angles, then matched the footage up when they went back to the studio to film the actors in front of the blue screens. The Phantom Menace. George Lucas's long-awaited return to the Star Wars universe didn't fail financially, but it did let down a number of fans, who were quick to turn on new CGI character Jar Jar Binks. Despite the overwhelmingly negative reaction to the character, Ahmed Best, the man who played the Gungan, is proud of the fact that he broke new ground with Jar Jar. He explained, "One of the biggest reasons I took it was because of the challenge of it. It hadn't been done before. There was no Andy Serkis in Gollum, no Na'vi from Avatar. I was working with George to pioneer this new character form of acting and storytelling." Unlike Best, the actor who played Darth Maul only has fond memories of The Phantom Menace, his first experience on a movie set. Martial artist and actor Ray Park was initially only brought in to film some test footage, but Lucas liked his work so much that he decided to cast him as the Sith Lord. Park's primary fighting style is wushu, but he also practiced gymnastics and ballet in preparation for his big fight scene with Obi-Wan Kenobi and Qui-Gon Jinn. Once the choreography was worked out, the scene was filmed in front of a custom blue set and handed off to ILM, just one of the many sequences they were required to complete. Attack of the Clones. The ongoing advances in CGI meant that Lucas could set stories in parts of his galaxy that were previously inaccessible, which he took full advantage of in Attack of the Clones. He explained, "That was the fun part of writing the project. I wasn't limited. Whatever my imagination could come up with, I would just put down on the page and say, we'll worry about this later." Animation director Rob Coleman was initially under the impression that some of the cityscapes and backgrounds Lucas required for Episode 2 were going to have some practical elements, but he soon learned this wasn't the case. Of the 2,000 effect shots in Attack of the Clones, around half include completely computer-generated characters. A team of 60 animators worked alongside 340 ILM artists and technicians to render some of the most well-known Star Wars faces in CGI, including a certain little green Jedi Master. Rob Coleman explained, "The biggest technical challenge for me was animating Yoda. That was due to Frank Oz having created that character in The Empire Strikes Back as a puppet. This time Yoda is much more active and prominent. He actually runs and has a lightsaber battle." Yoda's duel with Count Dooku was one of the film's big visual effects set pieces, but it required some human input from Christopher Lee, who was one of the many cast members forced to work with blue screens for long periods of time. Revenge of the Sith. According to Ian McDiarmid, who played Chief Palpatine, the use of green screen was really ramped up for the third and final film in the Lucas prequel trilogy, which had the most effect shots yet. He told The Telegraph, "So much of the filming took place in front of a green screen. I used to feel great sympathy for Ewan and Hayden because they had so much fighting to do and quite often had to fight imagined enemies. George often hadn't decided on the details of the film, so Ewan and Hayden didn't know if they were filming an ironic moment or whether they were about to die." Episode 3 also introduced us to General Grievous, the lightsaber-wielding cyborg who held the title of Supreme Commander of the Droid Army during the Clone Wars. Upon receiving the design for the character, animation director Rob Coleman knew ILM were going to have a tough job breathing life into this one. He explained, "Since his movement was so restricted, we decided to have him talk with his hands, because although there is a grill pattern where his mouth should be, there are no articulating bits for his mouth, no lip sync or facial expressions, no brow to move. no indication of what he is feeling or thinking. Grievous wasn't the only villain without eyebrows in this movie. It's in Episode 3 that we get to see Anakin Skywalker become Darth Vader after he's badly burned in a battle with Obi-Wan, a scene which had its own effects challenges. Hayden Christensen wasn't originally going to be the person in the iconic suit, but in the end, he convinced Lucas to let him play the part.
I begged and pleaded, and they were nice enough to build a Darth Vader suit that actually fit me.
The Force Awakens. After working with J.J. Abrams on his Star Trek reboot, visual effects supervisor Roger Guyett joined the director going into The Force Awakens, and the pair's partnership proved as fruitful as ever. Episode 7 made over $2 billion globally, while Guyett and his team were nominated for an Academy Award for their work, much of which incorporated practical effects. In particular, real models were often used for the little BB-8 droid. Guyett told Art of VFX, "From the beginning, we knew we wanted BB-8 to be as practical as possible, so that the actors could interact with him, and of course JJ could direct him on set. Removing the puppeteers from shots later on proved tricky, but Guyett had nothing but praise for them. Despite all the effort that went into making BB-8 real, there were still a number of scenes in which the character had to be rendered digitally out of necessity. Around a third of all shots, in fact.
Obviously, some of the characters couldn't just be done physically, and in those occasions, JJ was more than happy to push the digital technology of fully digital actors.
For all the practical work, Guyett estimates that The Force Awakens contains around 2,100 effect shots. Rogue One, a Star Wars story. The first Star Wars spin-off went in a new direction in terms of both narrative and style, and most critics were impressed with the result. One of the major talking points was the digital resurrection of Peter Cushing as Grand Moff Tarkin, whose character was portrayed by Guy Henry via motion capture. VFX supervisor John Knoll was able to track down a cast of Cushing's face made for the 1984 movie Top Secret, which gave them a huge head start when it came to recreating the late actor's likeness. The process took a whopping 18 months to complete and was done with the permission of Cushing's estate. Of course, Tarkin wasn't the only CG character in Rogue One. To create the droid K2SO, the filmmakers fitted Alan Tudyk with a motion capture suit and then digitally added the robot's body later. To get Tudyk's face at the appropriate level for the towering robot, they took two different approaches. In some scenes, Tudyk wore stilts while he interacted with the other actors. If the shot was too dangerous to use stilts, he wore a backpack with a paper cutout of K2's head positioned several feet above his own. Now that's dedication.
There's no way to respect this, you know?
The Last Jedi. J.J. Abrams spoke at length about using as many practical effects as possible in The Force Awakens in order to recreate the feeling of the original trilogy. And his successor Rian Johnson adopted the same attitude when he took the reins for The Last Jedi. Neil Scanlon returned to head up the creature shop, and this time they were tasked with creating a new breed of animal called a Vulptex, a fox-like inhabitant of the planet Crate. Scanlon told Entertainment Weekly, "The idea is that these wonderful sort of feral creatures had lived on this planet and had consumed the planet's surface, and as such had become crystalline. To get an idea of how such a creature might move, they fitted a small dog with a suit adorned with drinking straws. The next step was creating an animatronic puppet that the cast could interact with in scenes, but much like the BB-8 build, it wasn't possible to use it 100% of the time. Static models complete with 25,000 individual crystals were built for the benefit of the VFX team, who were able to scan them and render the creatures however Johnson wanted." Over the years, computer-generated effects have become an increasingly crucial tool in Hollywood's arsenal, but there's a right way and a wrong way to handle them. While some movies use CGI as a gentle paintbrush, others have clobbered audiences over the head with it, resulting in big-budget disappointment. Not all the movies in this list are clunkers, but if the digital effects were a little bit better, they might have been better received. Here are some movies that were all but ruined by their special effects. I Am Legend. This 2007 movie put Will Smith as the lone survivor of a zombie-ruled world. Aside from his trusty canine, Smith spends the first 40 minutes of the movie totally alone. Then the Darkseekers show up and ruin everything. Director Francis Lawrence didn't intend to use CGI for the Darkseekers. He wanted to rely on actors and practical effects, but when it came time to shoot the movie, the effects weren't convincing. With no time to make corrections, he had to resort to CGI. He would later describe the CGI compromise as a major disappointment in a conversation with Den of Geek. "When I saw the dailies, I broke out into a cold sweat. They were very pale and covered in this chalky powder to protect their skin, which was a really interesting concept, but it looked like a bunch of mime artists running across Washington Square Park. It didn't work at all. The Thing. John Carpenter's The Thing is a masterpiece of practical effects, with body horror sequences that still look frighteningly good to this day. The same cannot be said for The Thing's 2011 prequel. While the filmmakers worked to make the story fit with Carpenter's chronology, the movie's special effects don't hold a candle to what the 1982 version accomplished. That's not to say they didn't try. The production hired special effects house Studio ADI to bring the gooey, gross monsters to life. Unfortunately, due to problems with scheduling and budget, many of the company's practical effects didn't show up in the movie. According to Bloody Disgusting, the film was such a disaster that Studio ADI later fan-funded a film called Harbinger Down, which was made as an apology for what happened in 2011. Tron Legacy. The majority of the special effects in the 2010 Tron sequel are pretty great, except for the CGI face of a young Jeff Bridges as the movie's villain, Clue. Despite best efforts, the de-aged Bridges looked off. A Time magazine review summed up the issues, saying, "He looks just like young Bridges if young Bridges had had way too much plastic surgery, so it's hard to take him seriously. Clue seems more like an unfortunate Botox victim than a dastardly despot." Green Lantern. Before Deadpool, Ryan Reynolds suited up for DC as Hal Jordan, aka Green Lantern, the first film in a planned franchise for the glowing green hero. Those plans didn't pan out. People came to see the Green Lantern, but what they got was mostly green screen. While Reynolds told Yahoo Movies that the script was to blame for the film's failure, the mediocre wall-to-wall CGI didn't help. A review from Screen Crush went in on the movie's fatal flaws, saying, "Almost nothing on screen is real, up to and including the sense of adventure. It's just a bunch of digital stuff shooting other digital stuff. And some of that digital stuff looks really bad." The Matrix Reloaded. In 1999, The Matrix was a special effects marvel. But when The Matrix Reloaded hit theaters just a few years later, CGI took the driver's seat. The high-tech wire work and practical effects that made the original so jaw-dropping were washed out in a sea of CGI that looked iffy and aged poorly. This issue is most apparent during the movie's infamous Burly Brawl scene, a sequence that found Keanu Reeves' Neo battling hundreds of Agent Smiths. The concept probably jumped off the page, but the finished product of the Burly Brawl is really more of a mushy mess. The Mummy Returns. When the sequel to The Mummy hit theaters in 2001, digital effects were still very much in their infancy, but that didn't stop this movie from leaning into the spectacle. Like a cake that isn't quite done cooking yet, the effects look rubbery and half-baked, and they've aged even more poorly than The Mummy itself. This was Dwayne Johnson's first foray into the big-budget world of blockbuster movies, being introduced as the villainous Scorpion King. Unfortunately, the People's Champ ended up looking more like a video game villain when he showed up for his climactic fight scene. It would have been impressive on the PlayStation 2, but on the big screen, not even close. Hulk. Ang Lee's character-driven take on the Hulk has its supporters, but the movie's special effects are far from incredible. The Dissolve, discussing the Marvel movie, noted that the effects used to create the Hulk kept hitting the limits of what 2003 CGI could accomplish, making the monster look more like a work of animation than green flesh and blood. When Lee's Hulk hit theaters, the MCU was just a twinkle in Marvel's eye. Lee did the best with what he had. But at the end of the day, Hulk's Green Giant left us pining for the good old days of Lou Ferrigno in all his body-painted glory. At least that getup felt real. Well, sort of. There are movies with little to no special effects, movies with a moderate amount, movies with a lot of them, and then there's Zack Snyder's Justice League. If you want to know what Justice League looked like before all those effects were added, here's a peek behind the scenes. The first mother box Steppenwolf comes after is in possession of the Amazons in Themyscira, in a heavily guarded temple. It's the first time we see the horned villain in the film, and when he lands via a portal, he has no qualms about slinging these women left and right as they battle him without fear. Queen Hippolyta realizes she has to take the mother box out and seal the temple, despite knowing several of her fellow Amazons will die in the process. As she escapes through a tunnel, awaiting Amazon warriors stand by with large hammers, ready to knock out massive stone pillars which will release several walls and trap all inside, hopefully killing Steppenwolf in the process. In reality, we know that these Amazons are just hitting large foam pillars wrapped in green cloth, as this HBO Max behind-the-scenes clip reveals. In part 2 of the film, Diana Prince gives Bruce Wayne a 5-minute lesson on the golden age of heroes and their battle against Darkseid, while the audience is treated to a visual montage of the whole shebang. We see Atlanteans, the Old Gods, a Green Lantern, Amazons, and men battle against Darkseid and his armada in an all-out war. Bodies are flying all over the place in this scene, as almost everyone, except men, can launch themselves into the air with ease. There is one shot of an unknown Amazon who climbs on top of her horse before jumping into the air to wreak havoc on some parademons. In a behind-the-scenes clip, we can see that her horse is not real at all, and neither is the world around her. When Steppenwolf comes for the second mother box, he has to look for it in the ocean, as it's being guarded underwater by Atlanteans. Mira is one of the first Atlanteans to challenge Steppenwolf and fights him off as he tries to steal the box. Steppenwolf gets the upper hand and almost wipes her out entirely before Aquaman shows up to save the day yet again.
Yeah!
An underwater fight sequence isn't easy, as this behind-the-scenes clip proves. 3 crew members had to help sling Jason Momoa around in the air as he hung from wires to make his movement look effortless, as if he was truly underwater. Just before the team revives Superman, they have to break into Star Labs, so they have the entire place evacuated with a false alarm put in place by Cyborg. Victor struts down one of the walkways carrying a mother box when he passes his father, Dr. Silas Stone. Silas is trying to alert the evacuated staff that the alarm was actually false when he sees his son is up to something and ends up going along with the plan. In a behind-the-scenes clip, it looks like the scene was filmed without green screens, as Ray Fisher dons his motion capture suit, fitted with 2 red glowing lights, and walks down the corridor with his father just behind him. Doomsday decapitated Superman's head from his monument in Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice, and it was never reconstructed. The revived Superman ends up using this head as a weapon against the Justice League, but it's not as effective as he might have hoped. As he picks up the head with ease, Superman launches it directly at Wonder Woman, who slices it in half with her sword like she's cutting a piece of cake. It's interesting to see in this behind-the-scenes photo, which Henry Cavill posted to his Instagram, that the green prop version still resembled a head. Later in the big showdown, after he blocks Wonder Woman's attack, Superman pulls her arms apart and headbutts her. She fires one right back at him, which takes him a second to recover from. After he's had enough, Superman delivers the headbutt of all headbutts when he lifts himself in the air and comes down on Wonder Woman like a ton of bricks. In order to get this scene perfect, a green screen covered crew member had to aid Henry Cavill by bending his legs in a way which brought more fluidity to his body while he was held up with wires. It would have been impossible for Cavill to bend his body this way while up on the wires, so the silly-looking crew member was essential to get it just right. It turns out that one of the movie's key outdoor scenes was actually filmed outside, if you can believe it. After Clark Kent sees Lois Lane and is reminded of who he is, the duo flies off to his family's foreclosed farm and spends some time in the field getting reacquainted. While the white farmhouse was real, the massive tree and surrounding buildings we see in the movie aren't. Large green screens were used so additional buildings could be added in, as well as a few oversized leafless trees. We had seen these extra buildings before in Man of Steel, where Clark's father Jonathan Kent hid his crashed Kryptonian ship after the boy first landed on Earth. Throughout Zack Snyder's Justice League, we see Bruce Wayne, Cyborg, and Alfred work on the Flying Fox, the jet Bruce constructed as a troop carrier. The team had some issues getting it to fly, but eventually the jet is in working order and carries the team across the world to take on Steppenwolf. Bruce mans the Flying Fox alone after dropping the team off on land and takes down Steppenwolf's force field, allowing everyone to enter and start smashing skulls. While it looks like Affleck really is in some type of aircraft in the movie, he's actually sitting in a wooden approximation of the ship's cockpit that remains stationary, and he has to thrust himself around to make it look like he's actually in motion. Ah, movie magic.
Disney's live-action remakes have dazzled audiences around the world, but it takes a lot of work to make these movies as visually impressive as they are. Don't believe it? Take a look at how these Disney live-action remakes look without the CGI. The visual effects wizards at MPC spent 2 long years building the wild, dense world of The Jungle Book, the vast majority of which was created digitally. VFX supervisor Adam Valdez told Animation World Network, "When they came to us wanting to do the movie with blue screen and 1 kid, it was daunting. The company had a team from its Bangalore office visit 50 different jungle locations around India to conduct research for the project. They came back with hundreds of thousands of reference photos, as well as plenty of animal footage for the visual effects team to work with. But creating the movie's photorealistic animals wasn't even the hard part. Making Bagheera and Baloo's interactions with Mowgli feel genuine was what would ultimately make or break Jon Favreau's live-action remake of The Jungle Book, and the MPC team knew that all too well." Valdez explains, "The guys in the rigging department spent many months developing and researching facial anatomy on big cats, wolves, and bears, as well as how they move. In the end, it was an astute suggestion from the director that made all the difference. According to Valdez, John had this brilliant idea of using Jim Henson Company puppeteers to work with Neil Setti, the actor who plays Mowgli, so that he always had a moving and engaging puppet. A young person leaves that to the imagination, and it came through." The visual effects artists working on The Jungle Book were also aware that a lot was riding on the appearance of the story's antagonist, Shere Khan.
"How long did you really think you'd survive against me?"
The human-hating tiger was just a guy in a blue leotard on set, but MPC's team of animators had to turn him into a fearsome villain. According to the company's VFX supervisor Adam Valdez, the challenge was in creating animals that were capable of conveying emotion while still looking completely natural. He told Art of VFX, "We can all relate to some things, like when a deer reacts with fright. We understand that, but how does a tiger sit down with intimidating attitude?" Valdez and his team were on a constant hunt for references as they built Shere Khan from scratch. He explained, "Many clips of animal movements were found, recreated, and then dialed into the shots. The animators spent a lot of time on the shots, adding delicate little touches. Of course, movement is only one aspect of making a convincing CGI animal, but Valdez was never that concerned about the fur. MPC has so much experience with rendering animals that the company has its very own proprietary tool, fertility. Valdez says, "It's quite powerful, and I think we have the best hair and fur in the business." To make it easier for Beauty and the Beast director Bill Condon to get a grip on a CGI-heavy movie, Disney decided to make the experience as physical as possible. VFX supervisor Kyle McCulloch told Deadline, "We had the special effects team build some of the characters as animatronics so they could actually be animated and moved around on set. We had life-size builds of them that we could have on set, and then we had puppets. The Beast was originally going to be achieved using practical effects alone. According to McCulloch, the 2 VFX vendors hired to work on the remake discussed using a mixture of makeup and animatronics, but in the end, the flexibility of the CGI option was just too tempting to pass up. They also needed to make sure that the fidelity of the actor's performance wasn't lost. By going digital, they would be able to take the nuance and subtleties of Dan Stevens' performance and reflect them in the Beast himself. According to McCulloch, if you were trying to do it under 1,000 pounds of makeup, it was never going to give us the clarity of performance that Digital Domain ultimately achieved in The Beast." When Disney decided to remake 1977's Pete's Dragon, it turned to a vendor with a proven track record of bringing fantasy creatures to life, Weta Digital. Weta has created some of the most memorable CGI characters in movie history, and has worked with motion capture legend Andy Serkis on multiple occasions. Serkis won praise for his portrayal of evolved chimpanzee Caesar in the Planet of the Apes reboot series, and Weta took inspiration from that character when it came to making Pete's titular dragon Elliot. As Weta's Eric Sandin told The Hollywood Reporter, "With Caesar, you really feel his pain and happiness, and with Elliot, it's the same. The big challenge was getting the emotion out of Elliot. The connection between the dragon and Pete is such a big part of the film." Unlike Caesar, however, Elliot wasn't portrayed by an actor in a motion capture suit. Sandin recalled, "We had a green wire mesh head that I would lift over my head. I tried to move the head as best I thought it would work for the shot, and then we'd track the head with our CG Elliot." Peter Jackson's King Kong won 3 Academy Awards in 2006, one of which was for Weta Digital's groundbreaking VFX work. And the famous ape still looks incredible today, but the company became even better at rendering furry animals in the decade that followed. In an interview with The Hollywood Reporter, Weta's Eric Sandin said, "King Kong had about 1 million hairs on him, and probably 1/4 of those hairs were simulated, and we interpolated the rest. On Elliot, we had 20 million, and we individually simulated each hair, so when Pete is petting or interacting with him, we get the interaction with the hair." According to Weta's head of creatures, getting Elliot's fur to look real during close-up interactions was definitely tricky, but the airborne sequences proved most challenging. Geos Johnson told Cartoon Brew, "There are lots of flying shots in the movie, and dialing in the right amount of wind for a dragon flying at very fast speeds also took some doing." Fans reacted with a mixture of bemusement and horror when the first trailer for Disney's live-action Aladdin dropped, revealing Will Smith's genie in all his blueness for the first time. Hello! Certainly, the former Fresh Prince of Bel-Air star knew he had some extremely big shoes to fill, but so did the visual effects artist tasked with turning him into a Disney icon. The Remakes VFX supervisor Chaz Jarrett told CBR, "We always sort of knew it was going to be contentious, I suppose, that there would be comparisons between our genie and the original, but ultimately we felt confident in the character we created." Finalizing the genie's look wasn't easy either. The team had been working on the character for a year and a half by the time the first trailer came out, constantly tinkering with his appearance. According to Jarrett, he wasn't initially supposed to look much like Smith at all, and the VFX team experimented with a range of more cartoonish blue genies during pre-production. Ultimately, however, they decided that they wouldn't be making the best use of the film's biggest star with this approach. As Jarrett says, "When you've got Will Smith, you realize what makes Will Smith work is all the little Will Smith mannerisms. If you try putting those mannerisms on something that isn't Will Smith, it isn't quite satisfying." According to Aladdin's visual effects supervisor, the iconic A Whole New World scene would have played out quite differently had it not been for director Guy Ritchie's vision. When Chaz Jarrett and his team first started working on the Magic Carpet ride, they envisioned the journey taking place over the course of an entire day, with the titular street rat picking up the princess at sunrise and dropping her back off at the palace right after sunset. Jarrett told Art of VFX, "It worked well, but Guy felt strongly that he wanted it all to happen at night as in the original. So he took helicopter units to a number of locations to Jordan and Namibia and Africa and filmed elements. The footage they captured blended well with the footage of Mina Massoud and Naomi Scott, who mimed their own recording of the song in front of a giant blue screen."
It literally felt like, a magic carpet. It was incredible.
According to Naomi Scott, the scene was quite the workout too, since the actors had to support their own weight as the rig shifted from side to side. The dress transformation scene isn't just one of the most iconic moments of the original animated Cinderella, it's one of the most iconic Disney moments, period. Naturally, the studio used snippets from the scene to promote its live-action remake, but this move ended up backfiring big time. In one trailer for 2015's Cinderella, star Lily James appears to look a lot thinner around the waist than she normally does, and the pre-VFX footage seemed to back up claims that her waistline had been digitally altered. The British actress denied that this was the case during an interview with the Los Angeles Times, insisting that she was just a really healthy person with a naturally small waist. The actress went on to complain about people who were, in her opinion, kicking up a big fuss over nothing. She said, "I think all that stuff's so negative and you've got to let it wash over your head." But how does she explain images that seem to prove that her waist miraculously changed sizes? It's all down to her on-set fairy godmother, costume designer Sandy Powell. James explained, "The skirt's big and the corset pulls me in, and that's the point. That's the shape Sandy Powell created." Tim Burton's remake of 1941's Dumbo was one of the most ambitious Disney live-action projects from a visual effects standpoint, largely because of the eponymous elephant. Dumbo was animated entirely from scratch in certain scenes, but when the blue-eyed elephant needed to interact with one of the humans in the story, preacher actor Ed Osmond came in. Osmond was kitted out with crutch-like arm extensions and had to walk around on all fours for 2 to 3 hours per day, wearing a variety of different green suits. The actor told Insider, "It's a very strange job. The struggle with the arm extensions is if you don't get the rhythm right, if you don't do right arm, left leg, left arm, right leg, you end up walking like a table." Osmond was also hooked up to an earpiece so he could communicate with the film's VFX supervisor, MPC's Richard Stammers, during his scenes. According to Stammers, the 4'6" actor was crucial to facilitating physical interaction and eye lines during some of the remake's most pivotal moments. Stammers told Art of VFX, "Having Ed there allowed Tim to direct the performance, and we would always do our first rehearsal and takes with Ed in place." The hardest part of remaking Dumbo was always going to be the flying scenes. It's easy to suspend your sense of disbelief for animated movies, but when you're watching a live-action film and the animals look real, that becomes a lot harder to do. In order to make the flight scenes feel as genuine as possible, the VFX team did a lot of research into birds and how their wings work in relation to their body. MPC's animation supervisor Catherine Mullen told Animation World Network, You're trying to get as much anticipation and effort into each of the 2 or 3 giant flaps when Dumbo gets off the ground. Those were the key moments. Also, making sure that he isn't rising up too quickly or easily. Dumbo flying solo was a challenge, but things got even more complicated when the elephant had riders. A 6-axis rig was constructed, and the VFX team used what MPC supervisor Richard Stammers described as visual production techniques. In a nutshell, director Tim Burton could see a crude version of what Dumbo would actually look like in the finished scene there and then. Stammers explains, Ava Green and the children, Nico Parker and Finley Hobbins, got to ride this rig, with each wide or mid-shot specially programmed. On-set compositing enabled Tim to approve performances in context to the animation within minutes of each take being captured. Winnie the Pooh and the rest of the 100-Acre Wood gang were painstakingly brought to life in 2018's live-action Christopher Robin, but bringing the honey-loving bear and his friends out of the woods and into England's capital city was a mammoth task for the visual effects crew. Framestore's VFX supervisor Chris Lawrence singled out some key members of his team during an in-depth interview with Shoot Online, including the vendor's global director of animation, Michael Ames. Lawrence explained, Ames brought an incredible attention to detail and the valuable knowledge of a practitioner. Often he would simply sketch exactly what he wanted. I thought with Winnie the Pooh he achieved one of the most subtle, nuanced animated screen performances ever seen.
No, this is very confusing. It may be the hunger. You've just eaten. Oh, that's right. Maybe I didn't eat enough.
Bringing Winnie the Pooh to the real world meant that actor Ewan McGregor had to act opposite some pretty creepy headless dolls in some scenes. But this was nothing new for the Scottish star, who told Screen Rant, I did it all in the Star Wars movies, quite a lot. It's like a sort of skill, just something else that you have to learn to do. There are a lot of weird and wonderful characters in Alice in Wonderland, and bringing each one to life in live action posed a unique challenge for the Remakes crew. Animation supervisor David Schaub told Cinema Blend, from a technical perspective, Stain was incredibly tricky, since every shot required an animated CG body underneath a photographic element of Crispin Glover's head. Because the Knave of Hearts is so tall, Glover spent the entirety of the shoot on stilts. This guaranteed that eye lines would match up and make things a whole lot easier for the VFX team, but for Glover, it didn't come easy. According to Schaub, the actor spent several days hobbling around the set trying to get the hang of it. But at least the process of getting ready to shoot wasn't too complicated. As Glover himself says, there were no prosthetics. There was nothing like that, although there was a scar application. The rest of it was done in green screen. Tim Burton didn't return to direct the sequel to Alice in Wonderland, but Disney did manage to secure the services of Ken Ralston, who helped oversee the visual effects on the first movie. Knowing full well that Alice Through the Looking Glass was going to be an even bigger challenge for the visual effects department, Ralston brought his Sony Pictures Imageworks colleague Jay Red along for some much-needed support. Red told Animation World Network, when we started looking at the show, we knew it was going to be gigantic. There was more variety in this one than the first one. You could safely say it was bigger. There were more varied environments than in the first film. Star Mia Wasikowska worked with a lot of green screen in the first movie, so she was well used to it by the time the sequel began shooting. The major difference the second time around was that her role was a lot more physical, with more running and jumping involved. The actor told Quirky Inspired, sustaining that level of energy when you have quite little coming back at you in terms of the set is challenging. It's just a big green blob of light and there's not much. We had a few more sets on this film, which was really great, but otherwise it's quite like an abstract experience. When Angelina Jolie accepted the lead role in Disney's Maleficent, she brought in her own personal makeup artist and a special effects makeup guru. Together they created the anti-heroine's look, staying as close to the animated version from 1959's Sleeping Beauty as possible. They crafted facial prosthetics to give Jolie those high cheekbones, which reportedly made execs at the Mouse House rather nervous. Ariane Titan, the makeup artist who created said facial prosthetics, told Fashionista, they were like, wait, what? Prosthetics on Angelina? Why are we covering her up? They were not very keen on it. Jolie insisted on keeping them and ultimately got her way, but the movie still utilized plenty of visual effects. After all, this is a fantasy movie featuring some major action sequences, the kind of scenes that can only be achieved with CGI. According to Kelly Port, the movie's VFX supervisor, he and his team decided to adopt a less is more approach, which paid off handsomely. He says, for me, visual effects are a tool and should always be thought of as a tool to support the film. They always need to serve the purpose of the film and move the story along. That's when they're most successful. With Maleficent, we knew what was working well and what to pay attention to. According to MPC's Jessica Norman, Disney wanted the latest in visual effects for 2019's Maleficent Mistress of Evil. There were over 1,000 VFX artists working on the big-budget sequel at one stage, many of them pouring their time and energy into Angelina Jolie's flying sequences. Norman told Art of VFX, The actress and the other fake characters were filmed whilst attached to operated tuning fork rigs on a blue screen stage. In some shots, we attach CG wings. Some shots are full or partial CG takeovers. In a behind-the-scenes featurette, Jolie revealed what it's like being strapped into a rotating tuning fork rig for hours on end.
They're doing the up and the down and the spin, but your body is dictating whether you're turning left or right, and then they have to go with you.
Jolie later told Hello Magazine that she and co-star Sam Riley even had a near miss while filming a flying sequence. Thankfully, though, they both made it out in one piece.